Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Mortell, Director of Research at Blue Rose Research. Allie, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.
Ever really since November 6th, Democrats were faced with how exactly they lost the White House, the House, and the Senate. And there seems to be a lot of finger pointing, a lot of blame game. Did Biden drop out? Did that cause it? Did Biden staying in too long cause it? Is the party too progressive? Is the party too moderate? Are we not leaning on this type of leader too much? Blue Rose Research actually in the past year spoke with over 25 million voters. So I think you guys have a good set of data that paints the clearest picture of what exactly happened leading up to November, why Democrats lost. So to start off the conversation, what are some of your biggest takeaways of what you found?
Absolutely. So, at a high level, a lot of the trends that we observed in the 2024 election were a continuation of trends that had already started prior to 2024. Donald Trump had been making inroads with certain kinds of voters. He had been making inroads with non-white voters. We've been seeing educational polarization for some time where college educated voters were becoming increasingly Democratic and non-college educated voters were becoming increasingly Republican. When we look to what we're seeing across different cycles, a lot of these trends started as early as 2016 or 2020. The thing that we were specifically seeing in 2024, when we looked at who we thought we had won in 2020, that we were since losing over the course of the Biden presidency, the thing that those Democratic defectors largely had in common is that they were less politically engaged, less likely to vote, and generally less likely to view politics as an important part of their identity. And so that was a really important part of the story of what happened in 2024 is that less engaged voters used to be a pretty solid Democratic base. And today we are finding that those less engaged voters are more Republican. And had everyone who was registered to vote turned out to vote, we are estimating that that actually would have been beneficial to the Republicans, whereas back in the Obama era, high turnout conditions would have been more favorable to the Democratic Party.
That's really interesting. And one of my takeaways as well from the research that higher turnout would have actually hurt Democrats, not help them. My big question is why? Because as you said, in Obama's years, higher turnout would have affected Democrats more, would have helped them more. Why not the case in 2024?
There are some different conditions today that we have to look to. Globally, we have been seeing incumbents losing left and right across ideological lines. The post-COVID economy has been tough. Inflation is high. There's a lot of price gouging. The job market is tough. And so to some degree, the conditions are going to be less favorable to incumbents overall. But aside from that, we're also seeing some real shifts in the media landscape. Today, TikTok has exploded as a massive platform kind of across the electorate, but especially with younger voters. And we are seeing that the environment in this new digital media landscape is less favorable to liberals and to Democrats at large. So there's a couple of different things that we would look to here to try to understand what might be happening at a macro level.
Another thing that really stunned me, Gen Z is more conservative than millennials. And we saw a trend when millennials were the younger voting bloc. You saw younger people more progressive, and as you get older, you become more conservative. That's not the case in what we're seeing now. Why exactly is that?
Exactly. So one of the things that was different this cycle, it's pretty normal for us to see a partisan gap by gender, where women typically support the Democratic candidate at a 5 to 10 point higher rate than men do. But with Gen Z, especially with the youngest voters, that gender gap, ballooned to 20 points or more. So that really stood out to us this cycle as something that was just different from generations past. Overall, millennials were one of the most progressive generations, and Gen Z is looking like it's now going to become one of the most conservative generations. And that's something that we are starting to see across gender. Gen Z women are more Republican at this point than their millennial counterparts were. But that gap is really being driven by young men who are shifting more Republican.
And are they shifting more Republican because of Trump or more so just conservatism at large? I mean, is Trump a unique case here because he's so clippable. He says things that are so popular on social media. I mean, is this Trump specific?
While there are things that Trump does that we could probably point to, I do want to look globally to try to understand what might be happening here, because we are seeing this pattern to some degree in other countries, suggesting that there's something bigger happening than just the Trump campaign. And so again, I would point to this shifting digital media environment where, young voters, not just men, but young voters are increasingly getting their news and forming their political opinions from non-traditional sources. And so one of the things that our 2024 retrospective report points to as well is that we are seeing this relationship between heavy TikTok usage and defection from the Democratic Party. And so I would really point to the media environment at a macro level to try to start to make sense of what might be happening there.
You also saw a massive swing in both non-white voters and immigrant voters toward Trump. Is that because of the media landscape as well? What can you point to for that?
Trump made inroads with a number of demographics, and that includes non-white voters. Again, we had started to see him make inroads prior to the 2024 cycle, and so to some degree, this is a continuation of a trend that had already started. There are a couple of other things happening at the same time. We're continuing to see educational polarization where college-educated voters are becoming more Democratic and non-college educated voters are becoming more Republican. Also, historically, a portion of the Democratic coalition involved people who really identified as moderate or conservative, but they were voting Democratic for other reasons. And so some of those voters we are starting to see in this report have started to gravitate more towards the Republican Party, which maybe they're more issue aligned with in some respects. But beyond that, again, the big picture trend of 2024 is that less engaged, less partisan voters who don't really view politics as a core part of their identity. That's really the big shift that we've seen since 2020, is that those less engaged voters, who we also know are pretty heavy consumers of digital media, relatively speaking, they are becoming more Republican.
And to that point, you really saw in the lead up of the 2024 election, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance going on all these different podcasts, really infiltrating spaces that normally a big politician would not. Is that something that Democrats should be doing, going to these spaces like different podcasts, more TikTok? I mean, what does that look like?
It's a great question. Our analysis shows that the Republican Party is, outpacing the Democratic Party in the digital media environment in terms of reach, in terms of persuasive effect. And we're seeing this at a macro level when we look at the influence or the relationship between TikTok and swing away from the Democratic Party. Now, I am not an expert in the media space. I do have to look to others who do have that expertise, who have been, calling attention to this for some time now, that, the Democratic Party, and again, this is not my exact area of expertise, but the Democratic Party, we have pretty high vetting standards. We're really intentional and selective about giving our candidates direct access to, certain outlets and institutions. And so I don't have the solution, but I do know that the data is telling us that this matters, and this is something that we should be talking about and exploring.
I'm curious as to what the data is telling you about moving forward, because last week NBC had a report out that the Bidens want back in, essentially. They want to help Democrats any way they can with campaigning, with fundraising, any type of appearance. Based on what you're seeing, based on the data of the over 25 million interviews you conducted with voters, not you specifically, but Blue Rose Research, is that what Democrats want? Is that what the party needs right now?
There's a chart in this retrospective analysis that our team put out that looks at the relationship between issue importance to voters and how much voters trust either party on that issue. And what that chart very clearly shows us is that voters care about the economy more than anything else, whether it's the cost of living or inflation. They really care about their day to day material reality. But at the same time, we see that Republicans have a trust advantage on a number of those issues. And what's interesting is that the Democratic Party has some very popular economic policies, and we also have some really effective messaging on the economy. So there's a branding issue that we're really dealing with here. And that's the thing that we're trying to call attention to try to fix in the road ahead.
That's really interesting that it's not essentially policies, because the policies are popular when asked. It's more of a branding issue. So if I'm a Democrat, what am I learning from this data set going into the midterms to change my strategy to win in 2026?
It's a great question. So one of the things that this report highlights is some of our most persuasive messaging from the 2024 presidential election. And what we find when it comes to addressing the economy is that it is really beneficial to recognize the pain that voters are feeling every day in terms of dealing with the cost of groceries, cost of living, cost of housing. And also we find that it's really persuasive to actually name the villain, to call out that corporations are price gouging us, to call out that a number of billionaires are circumventing the rules and not paying their fair share. So we know a lot about the types of messaging that can be really persuasive, not just to our base, but across the entire electorate, whether we're looking at voters by age, race, gender, general engagement. So the good news is that we do have some really popular policies and really popular messages, and that's what we're trying to get the word out about.
And I'm curious if your data found that when you're looking at the future here, who that future is because when you think about Republicans, you think about Donald Trump. He is the leader of the party. When Democrats do have a deep bench, they have Gretchen Whitmer, Wes Moore, AOC, Jasmine Crockett, Newsom, Andy Beshear. But those are very different Democrats. And I bet if you asked a swath of Democrats, when you think of Democrat, what do you think? They would think of anyone from Kamala Harris, AOC, President Obama, President Biden. Do you think going forward, based on what you saw, that Democrats need to have that unified voice? Or is it more go to a deep bench and have that deep bench, use that, and you don't need that unified voice?
You know, we're a big tent party. And I think that is going to remain the case for some time. But what our data is showing is that voters are making it incredibly clear to us what they really care about. They care about the cost of living. They care about healthcare. They care about their day-to-day lives. And so we could have debates about, specific issues and, what flavor of policies we want to put forward for, specific types of issues that may be less important to voters' day-to-day lives. But they're telling us what they care about first and foremost. And I think that we can see, what part of the solution is and what type of messaging is going to be persuasive. And that's really the thing that we're trying to get folks to focus on first and foremost.
And that's probably what Democrats can do to win back those Democrat defectors. And I'm curious, because you have millions and millions of interviews, millions and millions of data points here, what do you think is missing from the conversation of what Democrats did wrong in 2024? Is the party having an identity crisis, and how do they move forward? What's missing there?
One of the things that's getting overlooked is that by and large, that night could have been a lot worse for us. There could have been a blowout red wave, and there actually wasn't down ballot. There was actually a lot of victories in the state legislature, at the ballot initiative level, Senate, the House, that are getting kind of overshadowed by what happened at the top of the ticket. So the thing that is missing from the narrative is that there's a lot that the Democratic Party clearly was getting right. And there were a lot of victories that, deserve to be celebrated. So, there's definitely a lot that we could look to say, okay, we should build on this. This is clearly going well for us. But again, I think that the most important takeaway here for Democrats going forward is the importance of centering the economy and voters' day-to-day lives first and foremost before anything else.
And to that point, that there were some victories on election night, it wasn't just a total entire red wave knockout there. Do you think then that Democrats looking at this data need a full reboot, or do they just need, a strategy shift, a branding change?
That's a great question. It's hard to distinguish between the two. We know that we have a branding issue. When we look to, when we compare 2020 to 2024, the thing that stands out in this report is that Donald Trump's favorability was basically the same. It was the Democrats' favorability that really dropped off over the course of those 4 years. And so to some degree, there needs to be, a reset button hit where we, get together and talk about, okay, what do we stand for? Not just what are we against, but what are we actually for? And it's a big tent party. There's going to be, difference in opinion there. But we do have a pretty good sense of a couple of, key next steps. And the first is making sure that we're really centering the economy and voters' day-to-day lives first and foremost. And then the second, as we already talked about, something is going on in the digital media space. We are clearly seeing that this environment, as it currently stands, is more favorable to the right than it is to the left. And that's something that we really need to continue addressing as well. So I don't know if that's, fully hitting the reset button versus just, doing a rebrand. But we definitely have our work cut out for us. And we have a good sense of what the first next step should be.
And I think that this is a really good blueprint. It paints a really, it paints a very expansive picture because of how many millions of voters you talked to. Data doesn't lie. The numbers don't lie. Do you think Democrats are going to be very perceptive to this data? And do you think they look at this data and then make changes to their strategy based on it?
I think that we're in a moment right now where there's a lot of soul searching happening and people are really willing to listen and to hear different ideas and sets of analyses. And so we have found that Democrats across the board have been really receptive to this, retrospective analysis that our team has pulled together. We don't have all of the solutions. At the end of the day, we're showing up with the data, and it's going to require a lot of different types of expertises and people from different walks of life to come together and figure out what the right solution is. But I will say that people have been really receptive to this analysis so far.
Ali Mortell, I appreciate your insight here. I appreciate all of your research. You are welcome back anytime. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me.